Mauricio and Ricardo, we are ready to go here, so vámonos.
E vamos ter o clicker para
If you
apresentação.
don't mind sitting around this table, it helps us. We look excellent on TV if you do that.
Yes.
You come here. Yeah. Well, okay, let's do this then. Good morning. My name is Paulo Sotero. I'm the director of the Brazil Institute here at the Wilson Center. This will be the fourth session that we do since September last year on the upcoming Brazilian elections of October of this year. When Anya Prusa, the program associate, and I were putting together this event about 2 weeks ago, we obviously said that this is should be one of the most difficult to predict elections in Brazil since the reinstatement of civilian rule. We just didn't know it was going to become this unpredictable. The fact, there is one important fact, this is the reason we scheduled it for today, is not because we are especially, that we see in the future, but it's because on Saturday, the official clock for the the Brazilian election started to run. This is when the switching of parties and politicians, and this is a Brazilian tradition, had to end. Whoever wants to run for elective office, president, governor, congressman, a state delegate, has to be in the party they will run for. This is 6 months exactly before the presidential election.
And stepping down also.
And they have to step down. The ones that occupy executive positions have to step down. That's the reason why Brazil has changed the finance minister and some other ministers. And so the
6 governors.
6 governors and all people that want to run are free to do, and others that had not affiliated with the party, including a former Chief Justice of the Brazilian Supreme Court, Joaquim Barbosa, is now a member of a party, so he is eligible to run for office, maybe the presidency. Since then, obviously, you heard about the events of last week that resulted in the imprisonment of former President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva. He arrived in the federal police quarters in Curitiba, Paraná, where the Lava Jato, the city where Lava Jato operation is centered, on Saturday late evening.
Yeah, early evening, 9 o'clock more or less, 9 or 10 o'clock.
9 o'clock, and he's there, so he is starting to serve a 12-year, 1-month sentence, and the implications of this fact are immense. Former President Lula is the first former president of Brazil accused or found guilty for a common crime. There are, in the history of Brazil, there were 5 with him. 4 former presidents that were jailed, incarcerated. President Lula is the first that is incarcerated for accused and convicted, and by a court of appeals now of committing crimes of corruption, money laundering. You can imagine what is the commotion of this in Brazil. The commotion, that psychological impact is huge. I believe, and you guys can correct me, especially Ricardo and Mauricio, who are in São Paulo, can correct me if I'm wrong. I think the masses have not risen in protest. There are localized events. Obviously, supporters of the former president, members of the parties on the left. It's a very complex scenario, and we are very glad to have some experienced people to help us understand this moment. And I will introduce them. Two are here with us, two are in São Paulo. Here with me, David Fleischer, Professor Emeritus at the University of Brasilia, well known to probably most of you. Some of the people that now are analysts of Brazilian politics obviously studied with David, who is an American citizen, naturalized Brazilian, and has been in Brasilia for many, many years. And so you can read their more full biographies here in this little leaflet that we distribute. Chris Garman, Managing Director of for the Americas at the Eurasia Group, also like David, a dear friend, and he has researched and reported and written on politics and macroeconomic management across emerging markets, comparative studies of national elections, has great experience in this area. And so I'm very glad to have Chris here this time. He could not join us the last time we ran a session like this, but it's wonderful to have him here from São Paulo. Another dear friend, Mauricio Moura, CEO and co-founder of IDEA Big Data. Mauricio was here with us in our last meeting after then Governor Geraldo Alckmin spoke about his hopes to be a candidate, which have been are confirmed because he is one of the governors that resigned in order to run. Again, I will not read their bios, but you have the information. It's available to you. And Ricardo Sen is managing partner of Prospectiva Consulting Company. He specializes, like Chris, in political and economic scenarios, development and implementation of public policies. Each of them have different affiliations. Mauricio, for instance, a non-resident of the Atlantic Council. And we are very happy to have all of them here to help us understand this moment. And they agreed that one initial round of presentations lasting 10 minutes for each person. I think both David and Chris have very few PowerPoints to show you. And with that, I would like to thank you guys again for doing this. Thank you for your presence here, those who are following this over webcast. And David, please, you can start the, I think audio can help you with the, or you can use this also. There.
Well, thank you, Paulo. It's a great pleasure to be back here at the Wilson Center to, again, talk about Brazil. And as Paulo said, the election campaign and the election have become more confusing, especially after this past week. But Chris and I will try to make a little bit of sense of what's going on. Is this one here? This?
Right. No.
Oh, okay. There. I listed a little background, which I don't really want to go through totally, to show you what has been happening since '85, as Paulo said it, when we returned to civilian.
This is a very well-versed audience. They
Okay,
pretty much
so
know this stuff.
more or less, okay. As Paulo said, the deadline dates April 4th The Supreme Court rejected Lula's bid for an habeas corpus so that he wouldn't be arrested. On the 7th, as Paulo said, we had the end of party switching and also the limit for stepping down. And then also on the 7th of April, Lula was imprisoned. These are the 15 pre-candidates so far. And we call them pre-candidates because they don't become official candidates until the party conventions in early July. There are 3 minor candidates that I didn't include because they wouldn't fit on the slide. But you can see I've also listed the latest Datafolha poll, which you can see Lula was leading with 37% and Bolsonaro with 16. But I also listed the deputies that each party has. And as you can see, some of the candidates don't have any deputies in their party at all. And Marina Silva only has 2. So supposedly by the law, you can only participate in debates if you have 5 deputies. So she might not be able to participate. We have supposedly pre-candidates. 47 retired military officers are pre-candidates, 1 for president, Bolsonaro, 4 for governor, 2 for senator, and then 40 for deputy, either state or federal deputy.
Next time we do something about the United States or France or England, I would like to have the same slide to see how many former military people in advanced democracies also
Our candidates.
are candidates for office.
Right. This I sort of tried to review Lula's pilgrimage or his Via Crucis. In 1982, he was candidate for governor, elected deputy to the Constituent Assembly in 86, then candidate for president in 89, 94, and 98. Then was elected president 2002, 2006. Almost got to be Dilma's chief of staff in 2016. Then he was convicted by Lava Jato, first level court last year, and then second level court in 2018. And as I said before, on the 4th of April, the Supreme Court denied him habeas corpus, and then he was arrested last Saturday. Whether his candidacy has been compromised or not, we'll have to wait and see. This is my review of the PT in decline. In 2012, they elected 655 mayors. But in 2016, they elected only 254 mayors, 39%. Usually, when a party elects less mayors, 2 years later they elect less deputies, and vice versa. If they elect more mayors, then they elect more deputies. So the forecast there is that they elected 68 deputies back in 2014. So in 2018, they might elect somewhere between 25 and 30 deputies. We reduced to a middle-sized delegation in the Chamber of Deputies. Right now, the PT has 10 senators, but they might end up with only 3 or 4 senators. Several are going to run for deputy because they don't stand any chance of being reelected. In 2014, the PT elected 5 governors, but in 2018, they might end up with only 2 or 3. So this is the map of the decline of the PT. This was the party switching that went on.
I need you to use your microphone.
Oh, okay.
For the webcast.
As Paulo said, our party switching window was closed on Saturday, and you can see how each party did. I don't want to go down through the list of all the parties, but this is sort of a review. The MDB was the big loser, followed by the PSB that lost 7, Solidariedade, the Christian Socialist Party, and then Human Socialist Party. And the big winners were Bolsonaro with his PSC. They got 7 more. The Democrats with Maia, 6 more. Podemos with Alvaro Maia, 5. PROS, which is one of the parties supporting Ciro Gomes, 5. And then the Republican Party, 4. The Hedgie, which is Marina Silva's party, only has 2 deputies, so she might not be able to participate in the debates on TV. The same with Collor with his PTC, and the Novo party, which might not be able to participate in the debates. Ooh, what happened? That was the end, I guess. Okay, so that's my presentation very quickly as to what's going on and how the legislation and the rules have affected the candidacies. So we'll have to wait and see what happens.
Okay. Chris, please speak up where he left off. And I know that you have also a presentation that we are put there, but if you could, there is one question that people are asking in Brazil is regarding the former president. Do you see the possibility of actions to be taken this week by the Supreme Court that would reverse, that would allow the former president to follow the full appeal process? I read this morning something from Poder 360.
Yes,
which
yes,
is
I saw that this
a
morning,
good
right.
news letter produced in Brasilia, seeing that the chances of actions at the Supreme Court that will reverse the situation to what it was like last Thursday are at 2-3%. They're not very.
Not very high, no.
I just, since you follow this, obviously, I wanted to.
Okay.
To. Yes, answer that.
Okay,
I want to Chris to.
What he's raising is a very interesting question. Back in 2016, the Supreme Court made a very ominous decision, very interesting decision, that if you have been convicted in a second-level federal court or a second-level state court, you can immediately begin serving your sentence and not wait until what the Brazilians call transitor julgado, which means you have to wait till the last appeal has been resolved by the Supreme Court. In Brazil, if you have a good lawyer and lots of money, that might take 15 or 20 years. So this is a huge change in the jurisprudence in Brazil. And the Lava Jato has put a lot of accused in jail already because the second-level Supreme Court confirmed their conviction. Now, if the Supreme Court overturns this on Wednesday, day after tomorrow, this would be a huge change again, would release from prison almost all of the Lava Jato prisoners and others as well. So, as you know, in the U.S., after a first-level court decision, you go straight to jail.
Chris, please.
No, yeah, and on this specific question here, fully agree with David. It's a very meaningful and important kind of decision that the Supreme Court's going to have to take. I mean, I would agree with the Poder 360 newsletter that the odds of them reverting that ruling this coming week are pretty low, because the court, I think, is sensitive to the fact that Lula was imprisoned, and then if they were to revert the appeal ruling just within the same week that he was imprisoned, it would be seen as kowtowing to political pressure. I think what's more likely to happen is that the dust will probably settle, and then the court at some future date, months at least down the road, they may revert that ruling, although it's very hard to call in terms of the timing of when that could happen.
Thank you,
But,
Chris.
So listen, well, first and foremost, I just wanted to thank you, Paulo, for this invitation. It's always a tremendous pleasure to be here amongst friends and such distinguished colleagues and friends as well on this panel, both here in D.C. and in São Paulo. I'm going to try to be brief and take a little bit of an analytic cut over how to think about handicapping the odds of this election. Evidently, we're in a highly fragmented field. We're 6 months away from the race. So it's hard to put probabilities in terms of individual candidates winning. So what we at the Erasure Group have tried to do is actually talk about odds of different types of candidates winning with different electoral appeals. So we can think about it along those ways. And what can we say at this juncture of the electorate to help us narrow down and handicap this election at least a bit more rigorously? I think the first thing that we can look at, and I think that before you start handicapping any election, the starting point should always be, what's the median preference of voters? Right? Mm-hmm. What is it that what is the demand profile for what voter preferences look like? And then you can try to map which candidates can best compete in this demand profile. Most electoral forecasting literature begins with that assumption. Obviously, there are a lot of variables that are important, but that's a good starting point. And what's really striking when you look at the public opinion data, and Mauricio in São Paulo, can chime in, of course, because he dedicates exclusively to public opinion research, is that if you look at the metrics of the degree to which voters are disenchanted with the political establishment, with political institutions with the existing leadership. What we're seeing is that the levels of disenchantment in Brazil are running as deep, or actually deeper, than the same metrics we're registering prior to the election that elected Donald Trump in the United States and prior to the Brexit referendum in the UK. All right? And I think that's going to be kind of a key backdrop to think about this election. I'll give you a little bit of a public opinion data here. This is a comparative national survey conducted by Ipsos Public Affairs at the end of 2016. This is a survey of close to 35 countries in developed and emerging market economies, including Brazil. And there are a battery of questions that they had that they tried to measure the degree to which voters believe that the system is broken on the one hand and the degree to which nativist sentiment on the other. And what we see is that when you look at the metrics of the extent to which voters believe that the system is broken, they're running pretty darn high in Brazil. When you ask the question, traditional parties and politicians don't care about people like me. Global average, which is heavily concentrated in OECD, 63%. Brazil, 68%, agree with that statement. In the U.S., 67%. All right? We need a strong leader to take the country back from the rich and powerful. 66% agree in Brazil, 69% in the U.S. You look at metrics of confidence in political parties and the media. They are extraordinarily low. Confidence in parties in Brazil at 9%, lower than the U.S. Trust in the media at 30%, equivalent to that of the U.S. We ran similar questions a year and a half later, so second half of last year. And what we found is that according to these same metrics, the degree of disenchantment only got worse. So if you look at traditional parties and politicians don't care about people like me, November 2016, 68% agreed in Brazil. You go to August of last year, if you look at the fourth question, that number increased to 90%. If you ask to fix Brazil, we need a kind of a strong leader to take the country back from rich and powerful, right? Remember? 66% November 2016. In August of last year, that increased to 86%. You ask the question, to fix Brazil, we need a strong leader who's willing to break the rules if necessary. 84% agree totally or partially with that statement. The mass media is more interested in making money than telling the truth. Again, 70% agree with that statement. You look at kind of the data. Say, what is the best feeling that represents kind of the future? Your vision of the future, or the best sentiment that represents the future of the country. And the sum of those who say concern with disgust gets to 87%. All right. So this level of disenchantment is extraordinarily deep. You look at the levels of favorability ratings of all the leading kind of politicians in the country. And almost all the leading politicians in the country have unfavorability ratings above 50%. The only exceptions here would be Luciano Huck, who over the weekend decided not to be a candidate, TV personality, and Joaquim Barbosa, the former Supreme Court judge, who actually we think we should keep a very close eye on. Okay, so what does this kind of, let's say, this demand profile mean, and what are the repercussions? I think the first is that we don't see the economic recovery that is underway, in which Brazil is going to recover at 3 to 4% of GDP, as really turning the tide on this level of disenchantment. We see this disenchantment as having structural roots. It is tied to a tremendous frustration from our point of view of expectations that arose with a new middle class. It is tied with disenchantment over the quality of public services like health, education, and security, and intertwined with corruption. Coming out of a deep recession and growing 3% does not turn that kind of disenchantment. And so the hole is pretty deep, which means that being associated with this government is a huge liability, not an asset. And we don't think that we're going to have a recovery to the point where voters are optimistic and want more of the same. Right? Number two, that being a traditional politician, being seen as part of the establishment, is a liability in this election. That obviously doesn't bode well for some of the established candidates out there, including the governor of São Paulo, Geraldo Alckmin. Now, of course, it's not only the demand profile. This is an election also that's going to be dictated by other variables like the amount of television time that you have in a campaign, party support, money. And so a lot of this election may very well hinge on what speaks louder. Is it the deep disenchantment with voters on the one hand, or the advantages that established candidates have in terms of distribution of party time, TV, and money? Because when you look at the allocation of time in the campaign, it's proportionate to your size of your party in Congress. And today, the candidate that has the overwhelming advantage on this front is probably the governor of São Paulo, Geraldo Alckmin. All right? But there's an important caveat, at least from our point of view, that some of these advantages are probably going to be smaller in this campaign in comparison to previous campaigns. Number one, the campaign will be shortened from 90 days to 45 days. So we have a shorter campaign cycle. Number two, the amount of free television time that's allocated during the campaign will be reduced from 45 days to 35 days, right? So you have less time to have these advantages work in your favor. Number three, the federal Supreme Court prohibited the ability of companies to donate money to political campaigns. By our calculations, the amount of money being sloshed around in this campaign will be cut by close to 70 to 80% in comparison to the previous electoral cycle, right? Obviously, if you're a candidate with parties in Congress, you have the advantage of having more of the official funding, but at the end of the day, everyone is poorer. So you add all that up, we think that the barriers to entry have reduced, and the disadvantages between the incumbents and the presidential race are lower. And finally, when you do public opinion research, and we've done some of this at Eurasia Group, and you ask the question, this extraordinary question, do you trust the information from social media, WhatsApp, Facebook, more than the information that you get from the broad media, right? And 59% agreed with that statement. In other words, obviously there are important pockets of the electorate that rely on TV, but this is a new phenomenon. So you add all that up, I think that what we arrive at is the following, that when we think about handicapping the election odds, what are the odds of the PT or the left winning this election, right? Lula is now in jail. There's a big question of whether he's going to be released before the campaign or not. But clearly, I think that, obviously the PT is still a force in this election. They have 19% party identification. But with this levels of disenchantment, the association of the PT and even Lula with corruption, I think is a big liability, right? So the odds of a PT winning this election, we think, are pretty low. And you do public opinion polling, and corruption is a big issue, at least for more than half of the electorate. Then you have Ciro Gomes on the left. Again, he's not necessarily a new face. At the end of the day, I think the left is going to have a problem of dividing their vote between the PT and Ciro. Lula in jail actually benefits Ciro Gomes because he can maybe grow within Lula's base in the Northeast. But overall, the odds of the left winning this election we still think are relatively low if you combine the odds of getting to a second-round runoff and then winning in the election. We put him at 20% at Eurasia Group, right, of a leftist anti-reformist candidate. The real question mark we have is, are we going to get a classic reformer winning, which is someone like Geraldo Alckmin, i.e. someone who is earnestly committed to much-needed reforms that Brazil needs to deliver and has full conditions to approve them in Congress, right? Or are we going to get a third group of candidates, which we like to call the quasi-reformists? These are candidates who are going to signal in a market-friendly direction, but lots of doubts over their commitment to deliver reforms and the ability to deliver them in Congress. But what unites this third category of candidates is that they all appeal and have more credibility to surf in this anti-establishment anger. And here we have Jair Bolsonaro, the far right-wing candidate. We have Marina Silva, the perennial third-party candidate, also campaigning on a different style of doing politics. And we have, critically important, Joaquim Barbosa, who just threw his hat in the ring, affiliated with the PSB, and has very strong credentials on corruption. He comes from very humble origins. He may be able to be competitive in the Northeast, even within the leftist base of support, and is a new face in politics. So right now, what we're saying is that this third category of candidates who have more credibility on the anti-establishment spectrum, on balance, have a little bit greater odds than winning than your traditional kind of candidate, like Geraldo Alckmin. It's tough to handicap. But at the end of the day, we wouldn't be surprised if one of these in the third category ends up being a president in 2000. It comes out on top in the election in October. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris. I'd like to offer the floor now to Ricardo Senes in São Paulo, who has, over time, emphasized the possibilities of a pro-market candidate, more of a centrist candidate, following all that happened. But obviously, we have not talked recently, so I'm curious, Ricardo, to hear your assessment of the situation. Go ahead.
Good morning, Paulo. Good morning, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be part of this debate and be part of this event held by the Wilson Center. It's really a pleasure. Well, I think Chris have gave a quite good a picture about the election. I would take my 10 minutes time just to make some specific comments. But in general, I think the numbers that he has presented and also some of the research that I have been following the Mauricio work on that issue, I think as they gave quite a clear picture about the mood in Brazil, the mood of the voters in Brazil. But let's just stress at least five different topics that, in our perspective, from perspective, it's clear, it's important to be considered in order to design what would be the political scenario for Brazil and also the economic scenario for Brazil. I think the first topic, Chris has already addressed it, but let me be more specific on the issue of environment related to the political and economic environment in Brazil that will be, I think, a critical factor for the election, and not the current environment, but what the environment we can face in October. Mainly take, I think, two issues. One is the economic aspect of the Brazilian current situation. I agree with Chris that we will have a major, I think, disenchantment environment in Brazil. That means the people in general are not trusting anymore in the system. Have a lot of distrust on the politicians, etc., etc. But at the same time, I think the life must go on. The people in Brazil continue to have very concrete interests. We have to keep in mind that the last 20 years time in Brazil has promoted a massive middle class, I think, feelings in Brazil, in a sense that the people has already experiencing, some kind of benefits from the markets. They have been assessing housing programs, education programs. They have assessed some kind of health service that provided by the private sector. And in our perception, it's not easy to think that the people will just forget the concrete interests that they have, a very hard life that they have to pursue in Brazil. And this would be a very important factor to make decisions in next election. That I understand that some of the rationality will be part of the decision-making process of the voters in Brazil. Why I'm saying that? Because I think all these issues related to the general mood of the voters that compels to the idea that the outsiders will have a better performance in this election, that people that doesn't have any kind of previous experience on managing government, I think they continue to be very very important factors for people not to move in that direction, at least in the very moment of being voting. We are 16 months behind the election, so we still have, we're not talking about a real election time. We are talking about a previous time, previous phase of the election. That means we have some features right today that will not be present in the very day of the election. So in the economic sense, I think some positive effects will happen until October. Not just in terms of GDP growth, but also would be the second year in a row in a row that the inflation will be very low in the interest rate. The real interest rate will be very low as well. That means the benefits of this better economic environment will, in our perception, affect the decision that the voters will make in sixth time in the October in Brazil. But besides that, and here I think there is a real complicated issue. The perception about safety in Brazil is becoming very bad, and there is a potential for worsening this perception till October, and this can affect much more than the economic performance of the country against the establishment and against the candidates that are linked to the current government. That I think this is a separate issue that we have to address in a separate way, but because of course the safety is not a federal issue in Brazil, it's related to the state governor's agenda. But in this election, the safety topic will be part of the debate, and we have to check how this issue would be addressed by different candidates. There are other topics that I think is important to raise to discuss this election. As Paulo Sotero mentioned in the very beginning of his presentation, or actually of his introduction to this debate, is we are not discussing only the election for presidency, president. We are discussing a massive process of election in Brazil. That means the presidential election will be combined with 2/3 of the Senate, 100% of the lower house, 27 different elections for governors, 27 different elections for regional assemblies. That means we are talking about, a kind of war game. It's a massive process of logistics, money, alliance, communication strategy. It's not just the president candidate that is relevant for this dynamic. It's the combination of the president candidate with the machinery behind him. And this brings us to the third topic that I would like to raise, is we understand at Prospectiva that the political machinery is very relevant. What I call political machinery is the traditional way of processing local, regional, and national-wide alliances. That means we have in Brazil, in the previous 6 elections, basically 2 large machineries working behind the most important candidates. One, of course, is traditionally led by PT since 2002, actually since the end of the 90s. And they have been quite capable to combine local support with state level support and combine with a federal and presidential campaign. The other leader of this election was the PSDB, was the candidate from the right, center-right, I would say, in the ideological spectrum. And they also was very capable to manage this 3-level campaign strategy. We are not just discussing issue about money. Of course, as Chris mentioned, the distribution of money actually would be basically the electoral fund and the political party funds that we have in Brazil. And this is divided in proportion of the representation of the parties in the lower house, or the combination of the representations of the parties that make a single coalition. In the case that I think will happen both to the left and to the center right. So the coalitions will bring basically much better access to the public money, the electoral fund, and also for the television time for this election. But it's not bring all the critical factor for what we call political machinery. Also, the combination of this resource, money resource, television time, and this kind of local support in every single city, every single neighborhood in the country, linked with the the governor elections, linked to the election of a senator, etc. And finally, all of this linked to the presidential candidate. So this, I think, is critical fact when we mention the issue of political machinery. It's not just fund, it's not just television time. This, of course, is part of this machinery, but it's also the capacity to access, to have a leader or an allied in every single city, every single neighborhood in the country. So this would be my 5 different topics, and finally give, I think, using the previous presentation, combined with these 5 factors, what would be the scenario in our perspective? Basically, we understand that the probability of this election will continue to be that the runoff will have someone from the left. I think the PT candidate continues to be the major, I think, the most likely candidate to be as a representative of the left in the runoff. Probably the someone like Fernando Haddad or even Patrus Ananias from PT. I'm not saying right now the possibility to the left build a coalition. Maybe the one of 2 political parties may join the PT campaign, but I don't see that the potential of alignment between Ciro and PT would be, I think, in the next 2 or 3 months in the agenda. So basically, I think the PT candidate would be the most likely candidate to be in the runoff, representing the leftist groups in Brazil. From the center and the right, and this, I think, it's our most important bet since last year, is as we understand that the coalitions is critical for this election, for the reasons that I have already mentioned. I see only one candidate working to build a relevant coalition in this election. And this candidate is Alckmin, the only guy who has been moving basically his strategy toward to build a coalition for October. And as we are still 6 months behind the election, it's not clear right now if the Alckmin will be really able to bring to this coalition 2 or 3 middle or large parties, and another 2 or 3 or 4 small political parties, building a coalition with 9 or 10 different political parties. I think it's still in the mindset of the Alckmin leaders, Alckmin campaign leaders, is basically build a coalition before moving to the campaign in the streets. So basically, I think he's right now is, in our perception, the most likely candidate from the center-right to be in runoff together with the PT candidate. That's my comments. Thank you again for the opportunity.
Paulo?
Do you hear me?
Yes, now.
Okay, no,
Now
go ahead. Offer your comments. I was just mentioning last time you were here, you were highlighting Bolsonaro, and so you have studied this also. I'm curious to, and you have been in São Paulo for what, the past 2 weeks, so you have a perception from there. And just comment on us. Do you see the streets are quiet and will remain quiet in your estimation regarding the Lula situation, or because that's what we have been reading? So since you're there, please enlighten us.
First of all, Paulo, good morning. Good morning, my colleagues in Washington. Thank you, Ricardo, for having me here in our office today. I'm not as optimistic as Ricardo, and I hope he's right. I hope 6 months from now he's right. And ideally, but I want to make some points. I'll start with the question that you have. We have been studying the Lula voters, the Lula core voters, very closely, because of course we do understand that someone has 1/3 at least of the voting intentions. If this candidate leads the campaign, there is a lot of of voters out there for being for the other candidates to work on. And I have some, and this weekend, for the first time that we run a survey and we interviewed about 2,000 of Lula voters nationally, and 85% for the first time think that he will not be candidate. Because for months we are talking to those people, and we still had the hope that the Lula would be the candidate. They didn't fully understand what was going on. But after everything that happened during the weekend, there's first time that I sense that those voters now are going to be active looking to other options. Before there was a very touchy way to talk to them and ask what would be the second option, but right now they think that the most likely scenario will be an election without Lula. And even for them, even for half of them, they think that Lula will be in jail for a while. So 55% think Lula will be in jail for a while. So he's not going to be candidate. And I don't think those voters, those core voters, and I'm talking about the low income segment, that Lula is the main candidate for the poor. The poor in Brazil, they own a lot to Lula. There's a lot of stories that we hear on a daily basis talking to those voters that, oh, my family went to college because of Lula. I bought my refrigerator because of Lula. I first time went to travel in an airplane because of Lula. So those people love Lula, but they do understand also that he did something wrong. So they're not going to be on the streets defending him. I'm sure about that. They would vote for him because, given the options, he's the one that actually delivered to them. But he's not. They're not going to be on the streets voting for them, and I'm sure they will start thinking very seriously about alternatives on that. And on that, we are estimating where those Lula votes will go. And as an initial studies, an initial perception that we have with these Lula voters is that today, even after the jail theater that we saw during the weekend, I think that any PT candidate will reach the level of 10% of voting intentions very fast. So anyone that PT put out there with the support of Lula would be working in the ballpark of 10 points very easily, in my opinion. That's what we get from those surveys. 1/3 from Lula voters, they are more they are being held as of today, part to Ciro Gomes, part to Marina Silva, part to the extreme left. There's two candidates in the extreme left. But the other 1/3 of the Lula voters that strikes me, 10% of the Lula voters overall, they go to Bolsonaro, especially in the state of Rio. I always say that in Brazil, 1 out of 10 Lula voters, they say that the second option is Bolsonaro. In the state of Rio de Janeiro, 4 out of 10 Lula voters say second option is Bolsonaro. And the reason is because of Bolsonaro's proposals to improve public security. And I don't know which proposals, but that's what they claim. And there's some voters that from Lula that they say that they don't know what they're going to do. Some claim that consider not to vote at all. So there is a lot of space. One thing that I noticed, and I strongly agree with Christians, that there's a very light any chance of those Lula voters voting any candidate supported or any candidate supported by the current government. So being a candidate from this government is going to be very difficult, and they're not going to be playing to get those Lula voters. Second point I want to make, I agree with Christian, and I have a number here, but you guys can't quote me on that number because it's not a registered survey. I do think Joaquim Barbosa is a game changer in the election for some reasons. First of all, as of today, Joaquim Barbosa is known, especially by the higher income segments in Brazil. He's known more in the big cities. But his personal history, as you guys know, is a very popular personal history, and he has a lot of. If he runs a good candidacy, if he has like a professional approach to the election, he can tell his story, and it's a popular story. So he gets the argument of anti-corruption, He is known by the middle class in Brazil. He comes from the poor segment, so he has a lot of attributes. Of course, we don't know how Joaquim Barbosa will be as a candidate. There is a question mark, so nobody knows. Sometimes it's like Marina Silva. Marina Silva as a meet is much bigger than Marina Silva as a candidate. So we don't know how Joaquim Barbosa will be as a candidate, but he has a lot of good attributes. We ran a survey this weekend, 2,000 interviews nationally. So don't quote me on that. This is off the record. But he came as like he's fighting for the second place without Lula in the scenario. He's between 8 to 10%, and depends on the scenario. But still, he puts him in the same position as the PT candidate, as Marina Silva, as Ciro Gomes, as Geraldo Alckmin. So he's gonna be playing in the ballpark if he's really serious about being a candidate. So, like I told you, we don't know which Joaquim Barbosa will show up as a candidate, but he has a potential narrative there. And so that's, and I agree with the sense that was discussing here, that I see this election as a much more fire and fury public opinion mood than the other elections in Brazil. I do agree with Ricardo when he says that the infrastructure on the ground is key, but I do think that this infrastructure today is going to be more concerned with elect local officials, because the state elections are going to be very tough for the incumbents. There's a lot of senior politicians in Brazil they're gonna run for Congress in order to sustain their privilege forum. So that's gonna be a very different election. One thing that I think that the governor Alckmin has advantage compared to the other candidates, he's gonna be able to plan financially his campaign. So from day one, he knows how much he can spend from the. And I think the PSDB already announced how much they're going to put 70 million, the maximum amount that you can spend in a presidential election, up front to Governor Alckmin. So he will be able to plan his campaign, and I think this is a good thing. On the other hand, I don't see it, and this is working inside a lot of political campaigns in Brazil. The TV time is not as was in before. In 2008, first time I measured the TV time audience during the election, and in the highest point of audience, the TV time were getting 22, 23 points. Last year, in the highest point of audience, not the average, but the highest, they got 5 to 6 points. So people are actually not watching that much TV time, political time. Of course, now we have this 30-second spots on TV but it's still, the TV is getting a lot of ground. And the last topic, one thing that I do think that there's a lot, the election will be played a lot in social media in Brazil, because people have more cellular phones in Brazil than compared to 2014. People have more smartphones compared to the last election cycle. But I don't think it's going to be the main political discussion arena will not be held on Facebook or Twitter. It's going to be held in the WhatsApp. WhatsApp's not that popular in the US, but it's very popular in Brazil. And it's very popular in the Mexican elections right now. Right now, there's a lot of discussions being held in the WhatsApp environment in Mexico. And I do strongly think that's going to be most of political discussions. There's a lot of low-income families in Brazil that everybody's connected to WhatsApp. There's a lot of discussions in WhatsApp. Of course, WhatsApp distributes content, distributes videos and information a very fast way, and also cheap way. And so I do think that the election, we're gonna have to study a lot how people are getting information in their WhatsApps, and how, for example, fake news are going to be treated in this environment as well. But I do see that this is going to be the WhatsApp election in Brazil, Paulo.
So, by the way, we treat here at the Brazil Institute, fake news has another name, it's falsehoods, lies. That's the name of the thing, okay? Chris wanted to make an observation.
Yeah, just one quick comment here, following up, Mauricio, on your points, which I thought were really interesting, and I think it kind of reinforces a little bit of the way that we're thinking about this election, which is just a quick comment on Bolsonaro, right? Which is I think a lot of the debate is okay. So Bolsonaro is take Lula out of the race. He's leading the polls at 18%. He's a highly polarizing figure, and I think that a lot of the debate is he a flash in the pan or not? Is he going to peter out in this campaign? He doesn't have a lot of television time. He doesn't have party support, although he's making some inroads there. I think from our point of view, we don't view him as a flash in the pan. I think that his base of support is loyal. He taps into this deep disenchantment. If you look at spontaneous voting intentions, which is you ask voters who would you vote for, but don't give a preordained list of candidates, which is a better metric of stark support. The last CNT MDA poll had Lula at 18, Bolsonaro at 12, nobody else above 2. All right? So he has a core base, from our point of view, of close to 15. He's not an anti-Lula candidate. He's more of an anti-establishment candidate. So I think of all the candidates, in terms of handicapping the odds of making it to the second round, I'd actually say Bolsonaro may, it's not a hard bet, but on balance, he has a higher odds of making the second round than almost any candidate out there. So much of 2018 may very well pivot on who goes to the second round against Bolsonaro from our point of view, right? And that's going to be a very intense competition between Alckmin, between the left, between Joaquim Barbosa, and I would echo Mauricio's points on Joaquim Barbosa. I think he has a fantastic profile in this election, but huge unknowns over his ability to actually manage a campaign. And he has at least a personal reputation for being somewhat hard and intransigent. So that's a big wild card in this election from our point of view.
Well, we'll have a chance to revisit this probably end of May. We'll do this again to see what has happened. But I would like to invite your questions here from the group we have with us. Jorge Jaime, ambassador from Chile.
Yes, I have a question which is a factual question. Relates to the situation of President Lula. The question is the following. Professor Fleischer mentioned some of the legal aspects and why his appeal didn't go all the way to the Supreme Court and the legal changes that have taken place in Brazil. I wonder if perhaps Professor Fleischer or Mr. Garan can illustrate me about the following. I understand that the legal proof for the conviction of Mr. Lula is not as sound as it might be elsewhere. I understand there's no documentary evidence that the argument on the apartment is basically a witness, and that it is very shaky in so many ways. So, a lot of people say, to convict a former president for 12 years on the basis of shaky evidence is somewhat questionable. So I wonder if you could illuminate me about sort of the facts on this. Thank you.
Well, yes, many people say that the evidence against Lula in the acquisition of an apartment as a bribe from one of the large construction companies is shaky. But in addition to the testimony, there are documents as well. Enough so that the second-level federal court unanimously upheld the conviction and even increased his prison term. We have a law in Brazil that was approved in 2010, which is called the Ficha Limpa law, or the Clean Court Records law.
Was signed by Lula into law.
And so this law says if you're convicted at a second-level court, you're ineligible to run for office. So that supposedly is the main legal point that will remove Lula from the campaign this year. However, Brazil has a long history of appeals in all sorts of levels of courts, et cetera. So the registry of a candidate is in mid-August. But I'm not sure whether the PT wants to wait that long to decide whether to run another candidate or not, because that would only give the new candidate less than 2 months to run his or her campaign. So that the question of whether Lula's going to be a candidate or not is pretty slim. Most people feel that maybe
there's only about a 5% chance that he might become a candidate because there's a majority on the Supreme Court of 6-5, which is number one against Lula's candidacy or his habeas corpus, and also against changing the rules about a second level court conviction. So that Lula has, I think, 2 other cases running in the Curitiba court and another 4 or 5 cases running in courts in Brasilia. Some of them are pretty nasty. The one in Brasilia is, we have something called a medida provisoria, which is like a decree that the president issues. And there was episodes of selling these to the highest bidder. And that proof is pretty hard. And there are other cases against Lula as well. We're not sure whether those would be decided before June or July or not.
On this one, the proof, the evidence comes from statements made by the people who paid the bribe.
Yeah, the construction
correct?
company, yes.
Okay.
And also, the Lula and his wife, of course, she died last year, visited this apartment several times. And there are videos of he and his wife visiting the apartment and documents offered by the construction company to show that really this apartment had been allocated to him. Now, there's another point that the press in Brazil doesn't really talk about. This building has almost 2/3 of the apartments in this building have been allocated to PT militants. Lula had a girlfriend, she still is his girlfriend, or not, Rosemary. She has 2 apartments in this building, and several other PT notables have apartments in this building as well. So that's not part of the evidence against Lula, but it's part of what the owner, the construction company, OAS, this building, allocated these apartments to these PT people. So that's another part of this building, and it's complex.
Yeah, just a quick comment on this as well, because I think this speaks to also how the there's a communication battle going on over how to interpret the imprisonment of former President Lula. Right. Of course, the PT naturally is trying to characterize this as a politically motivated investigation by conservative forces of the country to take out a presidential candidate who is very popular, right? And in the process, questioning the legitimacy of the prosecutor's office and the judiciary, and that strategy has had greater resonance and success actually outside of Brazil than inside Brazil. Well, I mean, what I would say is that obviously I'm not a legal expert. I think it's fair to say that maybe of all the allegations against him, maybe this doesn't look like the strongest, right? But I would say that the body of evidence that has been gathered by the Lava Jato probe, prosecutors, the federal police, the network of illicit funding of campaigns, the network of indirect favors that were being given to the former president, maybe on an inappropriate basis, is pretty large, right? So it's so I think that we can't forget that, and I think it would be a mistake to construe these investigations as just politically motivated to take out a leading presidential candidate. And obviously, there is politics in this, and there is it's a highly polarized, charged moment, right? But I think that we have to take a step back and recognize the overall context. And this is highly independent investigatory institutions who are really taking their investigations to the last consequence in a context where many countries don't have such robust investigatory institutions. I think that's the bigger message here that we have to keep an eye on.
Well, in addition to the PT, there are 14 other political parties whose members are accused in the Lava Jato investigation. So it's not just the PT. The PMDB has the second largest number of accused. And as you probably know, our current president, Michel Temer, has had 2 major formal accusations lodged by the chief prosecutor, and probably a third may be coming forth in the next couple months. So we have to remember that the accusations by the Lava Jato include a total of 14 parties. Even Collor is being investigated.
Just to add one detail, Jorge, is that the gentleman from the OAS company that gave this testimony, indicating that yes, the apartment was for Lula, is currently in prison, just 1 floor below where Lula is, okay? And the other person is the former Minister of Finance, Antonio Palocci, who made some very damaging statements under oath plea bargain, and suggesting, saying that this operation was absolutely directed by the former president. So this is not, I just wanted to, I don't know if they are correct. They are going to stand examination to the last level, but people in Brazil are not inventing stuff, okay? This did happen. Petrobras, the largest company in Brazil, was assaulted by a group of private companies. And there was a coalition of political parties that facilitated that assault. This is evidence, and this is why Brazilians are very alert to all of
Petrobras
this.
was almost destroyed.
Yes. So I have now.
Steve Kaplan, fellow here at the Wilson Center currently, also professor at GW. This point actually picks up on David's last point about Lava Jato implicating a whole range of political parties within Brazil. Ricardo Senes was mentioning the importance of the traditional political machinery. I was wondering how Lava Jato changes the financing of campaigns this year, right? So political machinery historically has been very important. Will it be as important given what I would imagine would be more constrained financing in this current environment?
Who wants to take that?
Well, something that's not been mentioned is that as of the 2016 elections, the municipal elections, candidates were allowed to use their own money. And so some of the candidates were fairly wealthy and used a lot of their own money in their own campaigns. Ron Doughty is an example in Sao Paulo. We have Flavio Rocha, who got into the campaign, who is the owner of one of the largest retail chains in Brazil, Lojas Riachuelo, who will probably use a lot of his own money in the campaign. So that in governor's races and in races for the Senate, they're going to try to recruit some candidates who are wealthy and can use their own money. And the law says that the candidate has no limits to using his own money in the campaign. So that's another factor that an outsider with a lot of money has a pretty good chance. And we had several outsiders who elected mayors in large cities in Brazil in 2016 using their own money.
Guys in São Paulo, you have anything to add on Steve's question? Oops.
Lost the connection.
No, we
Lost the sound.
do something there.
Okay,
Push a button.
can you hear me?
Yeah,
now we can.
See?
Okay. No, just to add a comment in terms of the fund that will support all this political machinery. I think this is real the critical fact. To use the term that Chris has used, everybody will be very poor in this election comparing with the last 5 or 6 election in Brazil. We are talking about 20%, 15% of the total money that would be available for campaign in this election. That's why I think the traditional structure of the political parties, the local alliance, all these current mayor, current local political organization, committees, etc., will be very relevant for this election because they continue to be able to perform in favor of one candidate or another, even with no money. I would say this they will work for their own benefit. They will continue to work based on the political alliance. So I think this is critical for this moment and put much more, I think, this situation is more favorable for the large parties. The large parties can resist, they can use, they can mobilize more resource than the new parties or the parties that is really small, like Rede of Marina or like PSL of the Bolsonaro, etc. So I think this new situation even improve the capacity of the traditional parties to perform better in this election. But just mention, I think, one risk that this election will face very, I think, dramatically is the illegal money. We do have room for in this election to candidates that are linked directly or indirectly linked to the the criminal networks or the groups that are operating in a legal way. These people that already presented some candidates for the local election in Brazil, they can be, I think, a critical new fact for this election. So, as the other candidates would be much more restrained in terms of assessing money, the illegal money that can flow to the campaign is not something that we can consider a minor factor. So this just to add information about this specific topic about funding.
Yeah, and one lesson that we learned in 2016 that we had the same financial infrastructure was that especially the candidates related to evangelical churches, they had a lot of funding from individuals, especially people that instead of donating to the church during the election campaign, they were donating directly to the candidate. And of course, in a more illegal basis, there's a lot of organized crime that fund the individuals to fund candidates. Yeah. And I don't think this is going to change compared to 2016.
And just to add to this question, I think it's a critical question. How does the prohibition of corporate funding to campaigns and a 70 to 80% reduction in money in this election cycle impact the elections? I would agree wholeheartedly with Ricardo, but I would say that's the case in Congress, not so much the case in the presidential election. I think there's a differential impact depending upon what elections you're talking about. When you're talking about elections for the federal deputy race, there I think that the incumbent parties have more of an advantage because the access of only public funds reduces the ability of other candidates to be able to fund themselves in the campaigns. Actually, the percentage of renewal in the lower house may very well be lower this election than in previous elections because candidates who have access to official party funds will have an advantage vis-a-vis their competitors. And we're going to have the phenomena that Mauricio talked about, that candidates that have access to organized networks of funding, like the Evangelical Caucus, or even the PT actually can do reasonably well, given they have a strong party identification. But for the presidential election, I think that the impact is the inverse. Just because you can actually be more effective in a presidential campaign using social media, you're going to be participating in national debates, and so the dynamic isn't necessarily to strengthen the incumbents in the presidential election like it is in the legislative elections.
Okay.
The other question is municipal level support. Chris is right in the elections for deputy, state deputy and federal deputy. The support of local mayors and local municipal governments is very, very strong and important. And as I showed in my slide, the PT lost badly in electing much less mayors in 2016 than in 2012. So you have certain parties that ended up electing more mayors in 2016 than they did before. And so the mobilization of these politicians and political parties at the local level is very, very important, but not that much for the presidential election. The evangelicals hope to increase their position in the Chamber of Deputies with a much larger delegation and maybe elect, they think, maybe 10 senators. So the evangelicals are a very, very important part of politics in Brazil because the evangelical voter is very susceptible to being convinced by his pastor, his minister, or his bishop to vote the right way. The Roman Catholic voter doesn't give any attention to what the priest says or the bishop says, that a good Catholic votes for this list of candidates. The Catholic Church can't do that. But the evangelical churches, the voter support is much stronger.
Yeah, Catholic votes believe in separation of church and state, I think.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you. David Nelson with Global Business Policy, DC. Two quick questions. One is, will any foreign policy issues play a role at all in the campaign, whether trade, immigration, Venezuela, any of those? And secondly, a number of you have commented on the importance of social media. Who will that advantage? Are there any particular candidates or social movements that are especially adept at utilizing social media? I would ask who will Putin support, but maybe that's going too
Okay,
far.
guys. Who would like to tackle that? Please let's not be sort of effective
Paulo?
in our. Yes. Vai lá, Maurício. Go ahead.
About the social media, one thing that we noticed studying social media of the presidential candidates was that Bolsonaro is the only one that has like a really spontaneous movement on the web. So they don't have like a central organization or someone taking care of the content being distributed. It's basically people, supporters that don't interact with any Bolsonaro's consulting or anything. So Bolsonaro is not. They don't have an organization. The PT has an organized crew. The PSDB has organized crew. The other candidates, they do have a basic infrastructure on social media. But what strikes me about Bolsonaro is a very legitimate, real people sharing content, real people producing their own content. So in terms of, but like I said, this is the Facebook environment. I strongly see that the WhatsApp is going to be more relevant. And assuming that those people that are working for Bolsonaro in the Facebook environment are most likely do the same in the WhatsApp environment, he's gonna be a very significant player on that front.
Thank you. On the other part of David's question on this business of, for instance, foreign policy, Venezuela, any other factor, the United States, anything, people.
Well, some of the people loyal to Lula, including a person here in Washington named Mark Weisbot, who claims that the Lava Jato was totally articulated here in this city, in Washington, and that it's an American conspiracy against the left in Brazil. That's their take. Of course, the PT contends that Dilma was eliminated by a golpe, by a coup d'etat. Of course, coup d'etat done within the Constitution and by Congress, etc. But the foreign policy question is very interesting. Usually foreign policy is not a big part of Brazilian presidential campaigns. The trade thing depends on how bad the trade war gets between Trump and China and how that's going to affect Brazil negatively or positively. In terms of soybeans, it might actually favor Brazil. In terms of steel, perhaps not. We're not sure.
The impact of that on Brazilian elections.
Probably not much at all.
Okay. So let's go, John.
Hi, John Garrison, a consultant at the World Bank. My question is related to this about the Trump effect or not in Brazil, because it seems like in Mexico, the Trump effect is helping Obrador, José Manuel Obrador, but in Brazil, because some people felt that, the press says that Bolsonaro is the Brazilian Trump, and I don't know if that's accurate or not, I don't think it is, but I wonder if that could have an effect, either positive or negative, or no effect at all. Thanks.
Yeah.
Chris, go.
Yeah, I think that the Trump effect is not going to have, or at least Trump is not going to have any impact on the Brazilian election. And actually, I even think it's overstated in Mexico. What I think that López Obrador is, he's actually riding a similar wave of disenchantment that we're seeing in polls in Mexico, and he's better positioned in comparison to his counterparts in the PRI and the PAN. I'm not sure how much, I don't think that, I wouldn't explain López Obrador's position as anti-Trump or anti-U.S. sentiment that's fueling it, to the extent that it obviously it helps him at the margin, but I don't think it's the main driver. And in Brazil, I mean, there is an interesting analogy. I mean, I think it's important to say that the nature of the disenchantment that we're seeing in Brazil and in Mexico is different from that of U.S. and Europe. And in U.S. and Europe, it's a storyline of a lower middle class that has been felt left behind for all the reasons that we're debating here in the U.S. In Brazil, it's more a story of frustrated middle class expectations, and it's an issue of corruption and quality of public services. So it's not immigration, it's not nativism, it's a different beast altogether, right? And so Bolsonaro is riding a different kind of disenchantment in comparison to Trump, right? So the profiles are a little bit different. I would actually say that maybe the analogy of Bolsonaro is a mixture of kind of Trump on social media and Duterte in the Philippines in terms of the hardline and security. That's the way that I would kind of characterize him a little bit.
Okay.
Oh, Christopher, I have a question for you, Christopher. Is Alckmin still the Hillary for you?
Well, we got a lot of flack publicly for putting a piece of research out there in the last year, in which we were characterizing the election. And Mauricio, yeah, just to give you the context, everybody here, right, on your question, and that we essentially said that one of the challenges of Geraldo Alckmin is that he is an establishment candidate in an anti-establishment election, right? And so it's not to say that he can't win, and many in the press kind of characterize our analysis saying that he can't win, which is not necessarily the case. But we made the analogy to the U.S. election where Hillary Clinton was the quintessential establishment candidate in an anti-establishment election. She almost won. She lost by a hair. So, but it was a liability for her, and we do think that the analogy stands as a liability for Geraldo Alckmin. But obviously, it's not only him. There are other candidates out there with that same liability, right? So, but I think it is an important liability in this election. The real issue is whether the advantages of party structure, funding, and he can use television time to go negative on other candidates. That's an asset as well. If he makes it to a second-round runoff, I think that he could have a good matchup against Bolsonaro, for example. But the concern in the Alckmin's bid is actually to make it to that second-round runoff. Making it to a runoff, he can be very competitive in that matchup. But anyway, that's just more to explain the nature of the analogy that we did, but that we did in our research last year.
João Castro Neves.
Thank you. My question was partially answered by Chris, but looking at Congress, what will the next Congress look like in terms of renewal? Chris mentioned that maybe not a lot of renewal, but also in terms of ideology and party fragmentation. What does that mean for future presidential candidates in terms of coalition building, given that coalition building has been at the core, has been the original sin of most corruption scandals in Brazil? And if that doesn't change, we're going to see more of the same next year, irrespective of who wins the presidency.
Yeah, let me complement that question, if you allow me, João, just saying something. The problems that we face, the fiscal problem, they're not going to go away on the 31st of December. The fiscal problem is massive. The Social Security problem is urgent. And you could see people in Brazil, retirees, 30 million retirees of the federal, from private companies, experiencing what retirees of the state of Rio system now experience. They get their pension one month and they don't get their pension the following 2 months because there is no money in the treasury of that state. So with that, I just add this observation because it's not that they come and the year starts and there is a blank state. No, there are issues there pending that will pressure Congress into action.
I disagree with Chris. I think the turnover in the lower house is going to be quite large. Traditionally, it's about 50%, which is considered quite large. It may get over 60% this time because we have maybe 150 deputies who are under very serious accusations of corruption. And in their respective campaigns in their states, this is going to be put to them very hard. And saying Party X has 10 candidates that are looking for re-election who have been all these accusations of corruption. The Senate has maybe 35 senators who are accused of some sort of corruption. We have something in Brazil called foro privilegiado. If you are a senator, a deputy, or a minister, you can only be tried by the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court is not a penal court. Supposedly, it's a constitutional court, but the Supreme Court doesn't have time on its agenda to really get to looking at accusations of corruption against senators and deputies and ministers. But the accusations are very, very strong, and so because the Senate is going to have 2 seats up for election, the turnover in the Senate may be quite larger than normal as well.
Before Chris invite São Paulo.
Paulo, may I make a comment?
Yeah, just 1 second on this question that João just asked about turnover. Is how do you think that Congress will tackle the? There will be issues there. What's the ability of Congress to really function? The new Congress, is it going to be functional or
not?
Or not?
Wait, you asking me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Yeah, listen, I actually don't think that the Congress is going to be the Congress that's elected next year is going to be necessarily a bad Congress when it comes to approving reforms.
Okay.
I do think, and it's an interesting contrast with David, I do think that the rate of renewal will be lower just because the advantages of funding, having access to official funds, is it inhibits the ability of outsider candidates to come into the lower house. And the other thing too that's interesting is that the profile of the Chamber of Deputies is going to be a profile with more experienced politicians, paradoxically. And the reason is that that in a context where you can't have private funding from companies to campaigns, the real honeypot is the allocation of public funds with the electoral and party fund. And the criteria for allocation of public funds depends largely, first and foremost, on the size of the caucus in the lower house. So that is changing the strategy of political parties over how they rank order where they field their candidates. And speaking with many legislators, what I hear is that in previous elections, prize number 1 was the presidential office, prize number 2 was the governor's office, prize number 3 was the senatorial office, and prize number 4 was a federal deputy post. Now, you have to have a large caucus in the lower house to have access to fund all your campaigns. And so the rank order of parties are, we're going to concentrate our efforts on having a caucus in the lower house. So that means that ex-governors, senators, and bigwigs are going to run for the lower house and not for the Senate. And the senators under investigation who want to keep their privileged forum want to also be elected in the lower house to keep their privileged forum. So we're going to have a cadre of more experienced leaders in the lower house, paradoxically, and that's not that bad for reforms.
Ricardo, go ahead, but just answer one question. What are the chances of the Supreme Court in the next few months, still under Carmen Lúcia, get rid of the foro privilegiado? I read that there is already a majority there for that.
Yes.
Paulo, let just make a comment on the previous question that I think is critical. I agree that with Chris. I think there's a lot of indications that the level of turnover of the lower house will be very low and lower than the previous election. The number that I think it's more, I have seen more consistent. It's a number that was produced by an institution, an NGO in Brasilia. It's called GIAP, that they follow the campaign of the potential campaign of each representative in the Congress, and they indicated less than 42% of turnover. But more important than turnover is that in terms of names, I think the most important issue is related to the profile. I think the profile of the lower house will not change much. Basically, if even changing 40% of the names of the representatives, the profile, the predominant profile of the lower house will continue to be very much the same. And also add another topic that Chris has already mentioned. The seniors politicians from all different parties, for different reasons, try to follow a position at the lower house, not just for the special forum in terms of Lava Jato, but also in terms of the strategy that the different political parties are about to take. I would include PT on this scenario. I think there is a discussion within PT in which the threat of being reduced for 35 or 40%, 40 representatives for PT would be a major disaster. And they are thinking in how to avoid this scenario. One of the options for them is ask all the senior politicians of PT to run for lower house. So I think this is interesting. The general profile of the lower house will not change, but the seniority of the politicians that will present that, where I think will increase. In terms of your second question, Paulo, I think there is it is a matter of time for the Supreme Court to change the understanding, the basic understanding of the Supreme Court about the prison or not in the second level of the judiciary system. As we know, everybody knows, right now, differently from 2 years ago, nowadays we have 6 against 5 in favor of not being allowed to prison people or convicted people after the second level of the judiciary system. So I think it's a matter of time. I'm not sure that would be this week, next week, but I think before the election, we may have a change, a shift in the decision of the Supreme Court. No, I think this is my point.
Okay, now one word from David here on the foro privilegiado, which is this.
Yeah, Jean mentioned this. The
Yes.
Foro privilegiado was being debated and voted on in the Supreme Court last year in September. And there were already 8 out of 11 against the foro privilegiado to remove it. But then Giastoffoli, who was one of the members of the Supreme Court, asked for vistas. That means I want to study this more, with no time limit to return it. He has now returned it to the Supreme Court, and this may be on the agenda now in perhaps late April or in May. And when the vote continues, it's going to be a lopsided, maybe 8-3, a decision to reduce or eliminate the foro privilegiado altogether, which would be a massive earthquake or tsunami in Brazil.
Yes, then Juliano and then Peter. Juliano.
Yeah, hello, I'm Juliano Basili. I work as a journalist for Valor Econômico in Brazil. I'm very curious about something. Who do you think is going to become the favorite person for the election in Brazil after what happened with Lula? We have Alckmin, we have Joaquim Barbosa, we have Ciro Gomes, we have Bolsonaro. So we have many people, but who is going to be the favorite person after what happened with Lula?
Let me add one thing to Juliano's question. Assuming the indications now is that former President Lula will not be able to run. What happened in the party? We read in newspapers this morning that the tensions, the party, the Workers' Party is a coalition held together by Lula mostly. What happens in the absence of Lula? Would an internal friction there, damage the party? Yes, Chris.
Very good question, Juliano. I mean, what I would say is, the Lula's incarceration over the weekend, it doesn't fundamentally alter the contours of the election, insofar if it was always likely that he will be impeded from running, given the fact that he lost his appeal, at the TRF4 back in January. But it will have an impact. I think the question is, will Lula be in jail during the campaign or not, right? And so if he is released before the campaign begins, it matters because then he can be on the campaign trail next to the PT candidate. He can do the TV advertisements. He can round up the forces. So holding all else equal, I think that a PT candidate will be stronger if Lula is out of jail than if he's in jail, right? And I would agree entirely with Mauricio. I think any PT candidate, just given the party identification is at 19% right now, probably get to 10, right? The issue is, can a PT candidate grow above that and get to a threshold of 15 to 20, which is probably necessary to get to a second round runoff, right? And so I think, again, ultimately, I think that the problem on the left is that there's a division between Ciro on the one hand and a PT candidate on the other. The sum of both will probably get to 20. If Lula is in jail, I think on a relative basis, it helps Ciro grow more on part of that Lula base, which Mauricio described very well, can go to many different candidates. But I think it on a relative basis, it helps Ciro. So his odds increase a bit further. If Lula's out of jail, then you're going to have, that's going to cap how much Ciro can grow. And then, but I still think that in either scenario, the left is divided. You see what I mean? So I think that, but really I think that what's at play is the odds of a PT candidate actually making it to second round runoff. I think the transfer vote is overstated many times, but I'm not, I have doubts that a PT candidate can make it to second round runoff. But I think that's really the key variable to watch on our end.
Yes, I'm quite radical. I think that Alckmin is not going to make it. within the next 2 months, if he can't get off his 5 or 6%, the PSDB is going to be really going up the wall. And so we have to remember what Alckmin did in 2006. He was the only candidate running in the second round who got less votes in the second round than he got in the first round. That's why he's called picolé de chuchu in Brazil. So my prediction is that if Alckmin can't rise in the polls much at all, the PSDB may go for some other candidate, and that candidate is going to be João Doria. That's my very radical position.
Okay, Peter.
Can I make it, Paulo?
Yeah, go ahead, Mauricio. Peter, hold.
As of today, I strongly agree with all the people here that in the second round, most likely is going to be someone from the left field. As of today, Ciro or someone that comes from PT, and I think the question is right. If Lula makes to the ground, it's a game. If Lula doesn't make, it's another game. But I think the Alckmin will have to work very hard to beat Bolsonaro in the first round. So he's gonna have to reach the 20 points. It's gonna be a very hard work. Some specialists here say that the best strategy to Alckmin is to focus on the south and the southeast to get the most out of it, and forget the places that he's not popular at all, like the north and the northeast, and put himself in the position to win. But I agree with Eurajo's approach. Alckmin has a lot of Hillary on that sense. So.
Let's say challenge for Alckmin. Alckmin, he can make it to the second round. We don't discard that possibility, of course. But I think that what Mauricio says is that let's pay attention to the vote in the South. And there's one candidate that we have to pay attention to, and the name goes by Álvaro Dias. Exactly. He is a senator, from the South, ex-governor. He's currently polling at 5 to 6%, and he gets primarily the traditional voting base of the PSDB in the South, right? So there are some leaders in the PSDB who are very worried about Álvaro Dias' bid, because it could be enough to avoid him to making to a second-round runoff. If I were to make an analogy, he's kind of the Ralph Nader to Al Gore in the U.S. presidential election, where Ralph Nader, took 3 to 4 percentage points and robbed him of winning against Bush. I think that that we have to look at not only Álvaro Dias, but we also have to look at Flavio Rocha, the businessman who's going to have the support of the social movement that kind of took to the streets. If Flavio Rocha gets 1 or 2%, that could also shave some support from the PSDB base.
Lots of money.
And he's got money, that's right. And also João Amoedo, who's from the New Party, right? He could also, so you look at the sum of Álvaro Dias, Amoedo, and Flavio Rocha, that's a problem for Alckmin.
Christian, in Paraná, from our numbers, Álvaro Dias has 25%. He's kind of tied in the first place in the state of Paraná. Mostly of those, his 5% that he has nationally comes from the 25 that he has in Paraná. Flavio Rocha and João Amoedo, maybe they're going to get votes in Faria Lima, but I don't see any traction in both.
Yeah, fair enough, Mauricio. And I think that, Mauricio, that is a very interesting dilemma for the PSDB campaign, right? Because if the PSDB campaign is, who do you attack? Who do you go negative on to try to make it to the second round? It's not trivial. It's not a trivial question. Oh, no. Do you go attack against Ciro or the PT? Do you attack Bolsonaro, or do you go after Álvaro Dias in the South, right? Because you also have to keep an eye on if you go negative on somebody, where will those votes go to, right? So it is a fascinating question.
We have a question here on the floor.
Paulo?
Wait, this show. Let me. Peter is waiting to ask a question, so let's get his question and then you come. Peter, go ahead.
Okay.
My name is Peter Schechter, Altamar. Paulo, thank you for this great event. A question to any one of you, but I think principally to Mauricio, who I don't see any longer on the screen. I wonder if he's escaped.
There he is.
So I don't think we've talked enough here about Bolsonaro. And so I'm going to ask Mauricio to close his eyes and imagine himself in the unpleasant situation of being hired by Bolsonaro's campaign. What would you advise him as a way to How do you win that campaign? What's your message? What are the steps along the way? Who do you try to create a coalition with? How does Bolsonaro get into the second round?
I know Mauricio since he was a teenager. His father and I went to high school together. I always trusted him. So he's good, Mauricio. Wonderful.
I'll not,
Answer
just
the
a
question.
disclosure, I'll not work for Bolsonaro in any scenario, just for the record here. But there are three things he needs to do. He needs to keep putting himself as the outsider of the system, especially on the corruption side. He keeps saying that he's out of Lava Jato. This is very powerful to the voters. Actually, the other day he answered a question. Some journalists asking, Mr. Congressman, who is you're gonna nominate for Minister of Health? And he said, no, I'm gonna nominate a physician that is out of Lava Jato. And for the education, no, I'm gonna nominate a professor that is out of Lava Jato. So this is out of Lava Jato is very powerful. And I keep another thing that he should keep pushing. A lot of voters say that he has the best proposals for public security. I personally don't know which proposals are, but he speaks a lot about public security. And right now, people are afraid in Brazil, not only in the big cities, but in medium cities. The issues of security are huge. And not, right now is a presidential issue, not only the state election issue. And of course, that intervention in Rio also helped put this as a presidential topic. And I don't think, the worst thing that can happen to Bolsonaro is a campaign that's going to be held to discuss the real issues, because he doesn't have any clue how to do it. So I would ask him to not to speak at all. Not he got invited to go to the Jornal Nacional to have an interview. Don't go. And,
shut up.
and
A
then
stealth
blame
candidate.
Globo as something from the system. So more he speaks, worse for him. That's my. And of course, in the first round, he's lucky because the debates give like the candidates 1 minute to talk, like 5 minutes. So he does not going to talk at all in the debates. But in the second round, that you need to debate, you need to be interviewed. This is going to be very hard for him. I don't know that. So my recommendation would be don't talk. So that would be the.
Yeah, it's as you know, in the second round, it's equal time, right? So, see if Bolsonaro is there, he would have to explain himself to the, or not. I don't know. Do we have any other? Yes, please.
Oh, Paulo, let me.
Fala, Ricardo. Agora, and then we come back here and close
the
here.
previous question.
Yes.
In the previous question about who would be the politician that would be the candidate that would be the runoff from this area of center left. I think this is the question to be answered. I think we all agree that the candidate from the left may be part of the runoff. I think there is no big questions about that, even though there is a scenario, I don't know, 5%, 10% scenario in which would be no candidate from the left, a leftist candidate, but basically someone from the center right against Bolsonaro. But I would say that's really not likely. But the point here, I think, is the level of fragmentation of the center right. I think this is the question that we need to address in order to try to forecast who will be the second candidate in a runoff, that will be with the left candidate. So in the question here, how the candidates can fight, how can they define a strategy to somehow to address the issue of fragmentation. My point is the only way to escape from fragmentation is building a coalition. I think the only way of trying to reduce the risk of having 7 different candidates from the right, center right, and center, all of them with 10%, in this scenario, this would be the scenario in which Bolsonaro will be in the runoff with someone else from the left. So the point here is these candidates know that the issue is fragmentation. And the question is how will they can address the question of fragmentation. I don't have another answer rather than try to build coalitions that will take the majority of the voters from this area. So I think sometimes we discuss too much image, too much social media, etc. And we forget the basic issue of elections. Election is a concrete event that demands resource, demands time on television, demands local structure. So sometimes I think we have this trend to discuss 6 months before the election, what the election will be. We are not in election right now. We are just moving the previous, I think, the pre-phase of the real electoral dynamic. So this just to stress this idea. Sometimes we take March as October. March is not October.
Okay, Chris, just one thing. I heard this weekend, and I wanted to test this idea because we're talking about coalitions and Álvaro Dias pulling, who was a PSDB guy, and I heard that one option being studied is that the Southern strategy, where Geraldo Alckmin and Álvaro Dias get together. They are in different parties now, so Álvaro Dias would run for vice president. Does it make any sense?
Well, I mean, it makes absolute sense, and that's that would be a key prize for if the PSDB is able to pull that off. That would be very important for our Alckmin's odds of making it to the second round. I'm skeptical. Just given Álvaro Diaz's profile, the fact that he's starting a new kind of getting into a new party. The whole campaign motto is to do a different style of politics, and I think joining with Alckmin would undermine a little bit of that overture. So I think that's unlikely. But I do agree with Sinis in that that the coalition building is going to be important, and here Alckmin is going to have an advantage. If you look at, our bet is that the president of the lower house, Rodrigo Maia from the Democrats, who launched a presidential bid, I don't think that he's going to grow in the polls, and I don't think he's going to be a candidate. The Democrats may very well join with a PSDB ticket come middle of the year. The President Michel Temer wants to run for re-election. I don't think he's going to be able to grow in the polls enough to overcome resistance within his own party. I don't think he's going to be a candidate. I don't think Henrique Meirelles is going to be a candidate either. And so that means that the problem of fragmentation is more Álvaro Dias, Flávio Rocha, and Amoedo, not necessarily Maia and Temer.
Okay. Question?
Bob Hoff, for retired Foreign Service officer. For this election, do you expect abstention rates and ballot nullification rates to be higher than normal? And if so, what could be the impact on the outcome? Thanks.
Yeah. Absolutely. And maybe Mauricio can chime in here if he's got data, but the traditional rate of abstention or that you declare a null and blank vote in the elections is 25%. We may get that number up higher, to 30, or even higher than that, which is interesting, right? Because it changes the dynamics of the race. Let's say that you got 30+% that don't vote or that cast blank and null. So that means that when you think about the requisites of winning, if Bolsonaro's got a hard 15, maybe 20, that's not looking all that bad in comparison to the total electorate, right? And if the left has about 20%, but I think it's going to be divided between Ciro and the PT, right? You're already getting to close to 70% of the electorate there. I do have a small divergence with Ricardo, though, and so I don't think it's a done deal that the left will be in the second round. It all depends upon how you characterize the left. Yes. But I would actually start with, Bolsonaro's got a strong leg in the second round, and who goes with him is an open question. And it could be someone on the left. It could be, if you talk about Joaquim Barbosa as being on the left, then yes, but he's really kind of he's a mixture of a candidate. He's not traditional left.
Yes.
Yeah. The other question is that we've had Datafolha polls and other polls that asked the people who said they would vote for Lula, if you don't have Lula, who would you vote for? And some have said Ciro, some have said Marina, but a large majority, maybe 30 or 40% of these Lula voters say, no, I won't vote. I'll vote null or blank. And so that would affect the vote total for a PT candidate, be him Haddad or whoever it is. And the polls show that these Lula voters would become very alienated and would not vote at all. They might vote for governor or senator, but they might just turn off and not vote at all. So that the null and blank vote for president may be quite high, as Chris said, maybe up to 25 or 30%.
Mauricio or Ricardo, do you have anything to add?
There is a clear sense that this no vote is going to be high. I do agree, and we are working with the 30% estimate. And I do remember that the no vote, the blank and no vote and abstentions, they won the election of the city of São Paulo. They won the election last year at Amazonas. They won the election in Rio. So those group of voters that don't vote at all, don't show up and do the no vote, they are growing. However, we are seeing our surveys that those people are can be open to vote to an outsider, not only for the presidential bids, but for local bids. Remember that in Rio, that's going to be a completely unpredictable race. We could have the former soccer player Romário. We could have the volleyball coach Bernardinho. So those people that are not voting because they don't see any benefits in voting, they are, but from what we are studying, they are also open to what they call in Portuguese chutar o pau da barraca, or just vote to an outsider. So I also have to monitor that as well.
Very much. The last question, please, here.
Ann Schneider, and I wanted to add to the question about Bolsonaro and connect it to one of David's slides about the other former military candidates. And I wonder to what extent those other candidates have aligned themselves with Bolsonaro. We can assume they will, or if that's yet to be seen.
There's no poll or any opinion of these 47 retired military candidates whether they would be aligned with Bolsonaro or not. They're spread out over a majority of states, large number of states. But there's been no survey or any poll asking them whether they would support Bolsonaro. But that's a very good question, but we can't answer that.
Yeah, and I would say, I have been in touch with military in Brazil. I would not assume that the Brazilian military are sympathetic to Bolsonaro necessarily.
No, he was a very bad boy when he was an officer in the army, and he got stuck in the stockade several times because he did not follow orders. And so many of the senior military people have a very negative opinion about Bolsonaro from his days when he was an army lieutenant, captain, etc.
No, he was a captain. Lieutenant captain.
He was a captain, right? Well, lieutenant before he became captain. Right?
Well, I think we have done it. I wanted to thank you very much. I don't know if you are more enlightened now than you were when we arrived, because we will do this again. We will do this again in probably late May, early June, and then we will wait for the World Cup, because everybody insists that the World Cup has something to do with outcomes of elections, although this has been disproved time and time again.
7-1, right?
Yes, and my kids tell me to pay attention, because after the 7-1, I decided to, I am a pelezista. I decided to retire from soccer, but my kids tell me that you have to return because the team is doing good.
Yeah, and after we saw the Argentina game, that made us another reason to go back and start paying more attention. Right?
Yes, so here, we have to end on a positive note.
We'll have a
here.
final seminar in November.
Yes, we'll have a final seminar. No, we'll have probably one or two until before the elections, and I will keep you guys posted. We'll have other activities here. We are trying to think about, actually, we'll have something with the president of CADI tomorrow here, talking about competition policies, because believe it or not, the business of government continues in Brazil, and there is such thing as a government. And I wanted to thank you all. Thank you, Mauricio and Ricardo in São Paulo, Chris and David here. Special thanks to Anya Prusa, who helped, the associate of our program, who helped organize this, to our interns, Carlin and Aureo, who was an intern here for the past 3 months, and now will move on, but will remain forever attached to us, because that's what happens with interns in this program. Thank you all, and please stay tuned. And if you have religious faith, pray for us. Thank you.
Say a little prayer for me.